Okay, folks, I think we're ready to get started. If everybody could take their seats and, or maybe it's one last chance to get some chicken nuggets or whatever we got over there. Chicken something. So is there anyone online from the committee or? No, okay, very good. Well, thank you all for being here. Again, my name's Nick Winkleman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Corpus Christi. I want to thank all of you for your time commitment and your hard work and your due diligence. We appreciate that very much. That's the purpose of this whole committee. I do want to acknowledge Councilwoman Vaughn, who's here today in person, so thank you for being here, Councilwoman. We appreciate it. And with that being said, I just logistics. Remember, I'm an engineer, so the restrooms out here. I hope we all know where that's at. I'm sure we're going to have a full 2-hour meeting today. So if you need to get up and handle a phone call, certainly feel free to do it. Just step outside the door. Feel free, eat the food as much as we've got left, and. I think with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. All right. Let's roll. Let's do this. Okay, great.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Jose. I will be facilitating today's meeting. Today's meeting, we have a packed agenda. As you can see, we have 8 items, and we want to make the best use of your time. Items number 3, 4, and 5 are the heart of this meeting. These are substantive technical discussions that will require some time. We understand that all of you have comments and feedback to contribute. That's what we want. Just a reminder to keep a good sense of time. We want to hear from all of you, so be respectful of that. Items number 6, items 3, 4, and 5, we will get into the model parameters. We know that you have shared some insights already on that one. Item 4 is the results evaluation framework. The next one, we will move to what will be the review process. And after that, we will share the results of the scoring on the 2 statements of qualifications that we have received. All right? And we will finalize the meeting with next steps and adjourn.
And one more thing, Jose, I had an important message. So our city manager is on his way. He's going to be a little bit late. We did have some, we did a pseudo press conference at Lake Corpus Christi this morning. So he'll be here shortly. He apologizes for running late. Sorry about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's good to have in consideration. So we do have a purpose for today's meeting, and that is completely aligned to the agenda we just went over. Number 1, we want to recollect your input, your feedback, concerns, comments on the model parameters. All of that will be diligently documented and passed over to the city staff so that the city staff can work along with Plumber and the selected firm on a statement of work. We want to collect also your comments on the results evaluation criteria. So what is that? The results evaluation criteria, we are referring to what we want to see to understand if there will be an impact at the bay. So that is what we want to address at that point. Next point is the QA and QC process. We have heard and we have received several emails from all of you, all of that documented as well, on process that you would like to have considered, right? This process already have some steps related to QC and Q&A, so we want to disclose that and open up conversation on how you see that as we have it right now. And again, at the end, we will provide the scoring results to the statement of qualifications, the two that we received, Hazen and Sawyer and Sphero. So again, there will be some more updates and we can open a round for conversation on that step. I want to be explicit and clear on what we mean by input that we want to recollect from all of you, right? All of you will be sharing your technical expertise. We have people with technical expertise. We want that. and you will share your priorities related to the model parameters, and we will recollect that. All of that will be documented so that we can pass it over to the city staff and they can draft that statement of work. So just very quickly, maybe you already saw this statement of purpose. This is brought by the city council meeting back in December when it was approved this committee, and I will just read it out loud so that we can be aligned on the purpose of the committee. So the purpose of the committee is to provide input and to ensure a collaborative and transparent analysis and interpretation of the far-field model process. Okay? Moving on to the next item on the agenda, I want to give you some orientation on how the timeline is looking like right now and where we are at right now. So you will see on the slides 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So phase 1 is, we already passed that phase, but it's a process where we executed the request for qualifications and the statement of qualifications, right? So the request for qualifications was issued on February 9th. We received questions from the modelers that were answered to all of them. That happened by the February 17th. Then we received 2 statement of qualifications on February 23, all right? We provided that information to all of you, for which we have recollected a good amount of scorings, and that was the initial deadline for that was on Monday, but we extended the time because we wanted to be sure that we recollected as much feedback as possible on the scoring. Moving on to phase 2, that is the project scoping. That's where we are right now. On this same meeting, we will be discussing the model parameters, the review process, the framework to measure the success and the impacts at the bay. And with this information, city staff will put that in conversation with the modelers to build that statement of work. On the next meeting, which is next Thursday, March 12th, we will bring the modeler to present that statement of work and to answer any questions as needed, right? So we will have an open conversation of what they are considering, and maybe they can provide some answers to that.
And excuse me, Jose, just to add to that, just like in any of our current water associated projects, the city works very hard to tighten timeframes, and we will be working very closely with the selected modeler and to make sure that try and tighten the timeframes as much as possible. I also want to acknowledge Councilman Cantu, just arrived. Councilman, thank you for being here. We appreciate that. Thank you, Jose.
Absolutely. And you will see that in phase 3, model execution, we still have dates to be defined. We are working through that. Having clarity on the phases and the timeline as we have right now, Plummer is here with us. Christine Arnold, she will help us introduce the model parameters section, right? So she will provide a framework that will help us recollect feedback through 4 different groups, all right? So at the right time, we will open up the conversation to recollect your input, your feedback, your interest. So naturally, we will fall into technicalities. Just a quick reminder that have in mind that we have a diverse group right now, so let's make sure that everyone can understand everything. And if you are not following, raise your hand and please let us know so that we can stop and clarify. All right? So I will pass it over then to Christine Arnold to help us with model parameters.
Hi, everybody. I am Kristen Arnold with Plummer. I want to kind of start out so that we're working under the same framework of terminology, just because we do have a wide dispersed backgrounds. So starting with some generic terminology, we've got a model calibration. This is adjusting uncertain parameters within reasonable agreed upon ranges so that the model predictions are matching what we're actually observing in collected data. That is kind of the first pass, with the purpose being to ensure that our model is appropriately representing the environment. Next is a model validation. A validation process is taking your already calibrated model and making sure that it aligns and accurately predicts observed data from a different data set. So we are testing, essentially, the calibrated model to a new data set. And that's just the purpose there is to demonstrate the predictive capability of that model and to ensure that the calibration was accurate. If the validation doesn't work, we can go back, we can recalibrate. And this is kind of an iterative process there. And then we've got a generic term of quality assurance, quality control. That is the procedure used for setup, execution, data handling, and reporting to make sure that we're accurate, consistent, and defensible in our results. So quality assurance, ensuring that procedures are followed. This is the process. Quality control is the technical checks to make sure that our outputs are reproducible. Quality assurance and quality control, the main purpose is ensuring that our results are good, technically sound, and that they are reproducible. Moving from here, I want to go over just a very generic kind of model development process, once again, so that we're all on the same page of what are we looking for, what are our goals. First, we've got defining our scope and gathering our data. We are collecting any sort of existing water quality data. We are identifying where data gaps exist. We're filling in those gaps as needed. Next, we're moving to building the model. That is the hydrodynamic component. That is the water quality component. Then we move to the calibration and the validation steps. Once again, looping back as needed to refine the model to make sure we are getting a good product. And then the very last step is our result simulation, making sure that we are simulating the scenarios that we want to see. Throughout this entire process is the quality assurance and quality control. We're making sure that there is good data used. We're making sure that the model is developed appropriately, the calibrations and the validations looked good, and then that the simulations in the end are reproducible and defensible. So jumping into the model parameters, this is talking point number 3. Our purpose of this conversation is to identify our inputs and assumptions that are going to be included in the contract scope, with an outcome being a prioritized list of the parameters that we want incorporated. We have 4 areas that we're going to talk through on the parameters. First being the configuration and simulation. So how is the model structured? How is it run to produce defensible and meaningful results? Second is the physical and the hydrodynamic variables. So what's the flow, the discharge, the tidal and mixing dynamics, and what is driving salinity, the transport mechanisms. Third being the environmental and the boundary conditions. What environmental conditions must the model be able to characterize under both ambient and simulated conditions. And then lastly, the assumptions and the sensitivity analyses. So what assumptions, what key uncertainties, and what benchmarks do we need to demonstrate that the results of this model are reproducible, good, and valid? Starting with the first, model configuration and simulation. So this will be the first point where we kind of open it up for discussion. This discussion is going to focus on the model setup. How are we setting up the model so that we can get meaningful results in the end? Some of the parameters that we may discuss, this is not a limited list, but the granularity, what is the grid size? The spin-up time frame, making sure that we have numerical stability before the model begins. The simulation duration, making sure, is it 2 years? Is it 10 years? How long do we want the model to simulate? What's the historic period of record? What years? I know previous modeling had used 2010 to 2011 so that we capture both a wet and a dry period. We can talk about timeframes. And what's that output interval? What is meaningful in terms of results? Is it results every 15 minutes? Is it every hour? Is it daily? Just discussing what sort of output would give meaningful data as to the impacts. I've listed a few questions here that may help guide discussion, but at this point, I'm going to pause and open it up for discussion.
Please.
I guess that's on. Well, good afternoon, I guess. Good. I would just add that having done this for years, that up front, it's good to do some sensitivity analysis just to see, is it working okay? And sometimes you might make it from a conjugate analysis, like, let's just do fluid dynamics. What areas of the bay don't get much flow at the bottom? You know, they sit there, understanding the recirculation, you know, and then build complexity from there. But the sensitivity analysis to show things like, well, if I put more salt in, you know, I see the salt levels go up around here. Just make sure it's working right. And that builds confidence from the team that from our standpoint, that it's working good. You also get a sense of what computational horsepower do you have, what you need to get this job done. It will give you insight into, you know, if we're going to do 10 years of this, are we going to have what we need to get that done? So I would say it would be good to have some interaction with them early on to help us build confidence and maybe point them towards, you know, what we want in a 10-year or whatever analysis. We could better, you know, decide that. But I'm pleased to see that it looks like, you know, what you've put in there is important. Some of the details about, you know, my thought was that we needed a short cycle to understand what happens in between tides when there isn't much flow other than the power plant taking from Inner Harbor and putting it into Nueces Bay. Is there a temporal effect that's relatively short? And then the other is really long-term accumulation and the 3D nature of salinity collection. So that's my thought on that, but I think you've got a good start here.
Thank you. Please, Jason.
Okay, so there's a study that came out from the Estuaries Program. It's called Vulnerability Assessment of Coastal Bend Bays. And it has a table, it's table 3, it's average salinity for the bays, and it characterizes the salinity in the bay as average, dry, or wet. And so for 2010, it's wet, and then for 2011, it's average. And I think for me, what I'm most concerned about is that we look at a multi-year drought, because that's when we're going to need a desal plant the most. So the following years, there's 3 dry years. So 2012, 13, and 14 are dry years. So I would at least like to have 2 dry years if possible. Since we already have data for 2010 and 2011, it seems like it'd be easy to add a couple more, if not 3 after that.
I would just like to second what he said, because I was going to say the same thing, that just looking at the most extensive drought data that we have would make more sense than considering a wet year, which would add to what we understand about it, but we're really worried about the drought impacts.
I think, and this is reflected in at least only one of the proposals, I think accounting for accommodating mechanical mixing in the ship channel, particularly in the Inner Harbor. I think there are some of us on this committee who have different opinions about the relative importance of that, but observationally, I know that represents full water column mixing on a heterogeneous time frame. We, no doubt, to account for that, it's going to require a series of assumptions which we can help sort of shape, but I do think that there's a mechanical dimension in the Inner Harbor in particular that is unique and needs to be factored in.
Just 1 second, Jason.
Right.
One follow-up question, Jeff. Could you please frame again what would be the suggestion or the recommendation?
Yeah, and I'm trying to stop short of doing that because I am not a modeler, and I recognize the challenge in doing so. But I mean, we have vessel traffic on a heterogeneous time frame that represents almost full, if not full, water. And I'll say full based on, sort of observationally, just based on visible changes in turbidity after vessel passage. So we've got, to the comment about tidal influence, I think that there are cases where the mechanical influence on the channel of vessel passage dwarfs the other hydrodynamics. So complicated, erratic variable to include, but in terms of model parameters, I think it has to be reflected.
Understood. Thanks. Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, I just wanted to second that because there's a CC Polymers desal plant that was permitted in 2014. It's 95% built and is likely to go online soon, and that doesn't have a diffuser. So it's just going to be a highly concentrated effluent that engineers for Friesen Nichols have said in a letter to TCEQ that it would not mix and just go straight to the bottom. So I think ship traffic is really important to look at. And my recommendation would be to do a sensitivity analysis where you look at a shorter time frame to see if it does make a measurable impact. And if it does, consider including that in the full run.
Thank you. On the time frame, I always think more is better. So the quality of data, how far back do we go on good quality data? And one thing to keep in mind, the big driver on circulation is tidal influence. And we've got a 19-year tidal cycle. So if we could go back that far, so we've got two things. We've got droughts, which we know are extremely variable, and then we have the tidal cycle that has more look to it. So I guess what I'm saying on the time frame, as far back as we can practically go with quality data is what we ought to try to achieve. And if we can go back 19 years, it would be helpful from the titles side.
Noted. Thanks.
Just to ask, we had a little bit of this conversation previously, so I assume you all have grabbed all those comments and are going to include those in this as well.
Previous comments are documented and will be passed over.
Awesome.
If you have something that you would like to bring back or highlight, please feel free to do so.
I want to add to what Jeff said. There was really good data collected for the permitting process where you can actually look at the flow data and tell when a ship is going in. So in terms of years, I would pick years based on where you have better data, because I don't know if data of that quality exists from the previous time. So, I mean, maybe somebody's got it, and if so, great. But, there's some really good, kind of, I think, I can't remember if it was 5-minute or 15-minute cycle data that you can actually, if you look at the whole spreadsheet, you go, oh, it just jumped in one data point really high. That's a ship going through and stirring everything up. So, thanks.
Just to augment that, we have a variety of vessel passing analyses that we've done in different reaches of the channel. The Inner Harbor is unique in that it's contained, effectively the width of the channel. There's not an open bay on either side of the channel, right? I mean, it's unique in obvious ways, but I think we have a fair amount of data from, if not perfectly analogous, at least relevant conditions that could be brought to bear here, and we have enough information historically about frequency of vessel traffic by class that 4 years where there's gap, there may be a way to extrapolate with reasonable assumptions too.
Well, to follow on that, with the finalization of the New Harbor Bridge, the size of the ships that are coming in and out is going to increase, and
not necessarily, actually.
Well, maybe not. But if it is, then maybe some simulation needed for those larger ships.
Just if I may just add a finer point to that, right? I mean, the Inner Harbor's at a depth of 54 feet. We have vessels utilizing that full 54 feet today. More of them will as we deepen docks to match it, but the air draft allowed by the the new bridge may accommodate some larger vessels, but they're still only going to utilize a 54-foot channel, right? So a little nuance there.
Noted, noted both comments. Thank you. Please.
So I was just going down the list, thinking about, again, the parameters. And so the first bullet point there on the right, your granularity, that we're kind of getting at the spatial component of this. And so there are a few things there that I think are really important. As a lot of the critiques of the inner harbor modeling point out, you really need that 3D, the vertical structure to be accounted for, the stratification. At a much larger level, just the boundary conditions, I think it's very important to have the exchange with Redfish Bay, Laguna Madre, and Oso, and then, of course, upstream in the Nueces. It's also really important, I think, to have the ocean forcing in this, because if you think about it over time, this plant's going to be operational for, what, 20, 30 years? So we're seeing, and we can argue all day about why, but water levels, the sea level is rising on the Texas coast. We have some of the highest rates in the nation. And so over time, I would expect that you're going to have an increased forcing from the ocean itself on the bay. So ocean water coming in, which is going to affect the residence time of the bay. It's going to affect the background salinities. So I think we need to be able to capture that ocean forcing over time. So then, you know, the other thing that was pointed out in those critiques of the inner harbor modeling is there wasn't a good handle on the sort of horizontal structure of the inner harbor itself. Like the grid just didn't really capture the inner harbor dynamics, so we need to make sure we're doing a good job of accounting for that. And then I would just point out on the Dr. Ben Hodges critique, he talked about the grid size itself and of the modeling, and he made a few important points there, which is that you know, you want to be able to capture not only what's happening in the inner harbor, but really be able to capture and model well what's happening right at the mouth of the inner harbor. And then finally, he makes a really good point. Sorry, I'm geeking out here, but he makes a really good point that the grid resolution in the model, it has to be fine enough so that you're capturing the entrainment and erosion of the model plume itself. So you need to be at a scale that's on the level of that plume and how it's getting, you know, either entrained or broken up over time. So that's the spatial component. And then your number 3 there is your time scales. And so in my mind, there's several important time scales that we really need to think about here. I heard several people mention longer term time scales, and I do think that we need to talk about, you know, if this plant's operational for 30 years, do we need to have the model running over that extended period of time? Because in a bay system like this, where you've got a residence time of a year and a half or more, I could see how things could accumulate over time. So you want to be able to capture that long-term accumulation in the bay. And not only that, but then we get back to this ocean forcing issue. If over time you're getting more influence from the ocean, that's going to affect the bay itself. So aside from that, you do have the wet-dry cycles, which I think are very important. And so there's a lot of different time scales operating here. Seasonality is going to be very important. So that's kind of my take on things. I know we haven't talked about parameters, but certainly salinity and DO. And the one thing I will say, since Jason brought it up, is that vulnerability assessment that was done. What this group did, and it was funded by Bays and Estuaries, is they looked at the salinity tolerances of a lot of different fish species in this bay. And so they kind of already built a framework here for connecting, say, salinity data from the model with impacts on the fishery. So I would just encourage us, however possible, to try and link into the framework that they've set up here, because that'll make our job easier.
What was the name of that again?
This is Vulnerability Assessment of Coastal Bend Bays. It's publication number 152, and it's on the Bays and Estuaries website in their publications.
Thank you, Mike.
I have a question and a comment. So DO is also very important, especially if you have stratified conditions. So we talk a lot about salinity, but obviously temperature is going to play into it. So that's where the seasonality, you know, when you get these extreme high temperature conditions in the bay, then you can get more stratification, and then you can have problems even with a salinity that is not that high. So that needs to be very well captured by the model. But the model itself is not going to be modeling oxygen, is it? I mean, because that would be like a biogeochemical component. So is the model output going to include would include some index of stratification, but it would not include oxygen per se? Or would it?
I think we need to encourage the modelers to include oxygen if we can. I mean, that's aside from salinity, that's your critical next variable that's going to play a role. So I would hope so.
Noted. Carrie, please.
Hi, I'd like to illustrate to the committee that the water in the bay near the Lexington is an area of human use, which should mean that this area near the north, near the mouth of the Inner Harbor receives special priority in the far-field modeling study to see if the desal plant would negatively impact the water quality there, a place where thousands of people are swimming every weekend in the summer. You can see this map shows that it's 2 miles from the plant where these people are in the water swimming. Fish and marine life are important, but any governmental assessment like this far-field modeling study is something that directly impacts human health, always gets a higher priority. Like if a human and a dog are fighting, the policeman is always gonna protect the human over the dog. So we need to make sure that humans are protected and thought about as much as we're thinking about fish and wildlife. For example, I think that this committee is ignoring the human use aspect, but is rather focused on salinity and oxygen. I'm really happy that we're doing that, but just don't forget that a change in the water could affect these people, which are largely a lot of these people, because North Beach is free, are lower income, lower socioeconomic bracket people, locals and people from out of town as well. The trickle-down economic impact that would occur if the bay water right here were to become unsafe has not been assessed and should be an important part of the far-field model. How will the chemicals added to the water through desalination, including acids, surfactants, and disinfectants, affect the water quality in the swimming area? These are typical ingredients of the defouling agents that are added in order to protect the desalination membranes and other equipment. When those new chemicals are diffused into the bay, how will that affect swimmers who could come in direct skin contact with those chemicals that are not currently present in the water? One more thing, ADTA is another chemical used in desalination. It is not biodegradable and can chemically remobilize heavy metals that are already in the channel, causing increased toxicity. Will that potential effect to the water quality be assessed? What I'm hearing in this far-field modeling committee is a focus on increasing salinity because that's harmful to the ecosystem, but the study needs to also assess the current water conditions near the swimming beach and then assess how the Inner Harbor plant would add to the present nutrient load or toxicity in this area, which could negatively affect the health of these swimmers, kayakers, jet skiers, and kiteboarders. And it needs to model the economic impact that not being able to use the water on North Beach would mean to the businesses like mine that rely on it. If this study does not model potential direct impacts to human health caused by the IH plant, we are missing the mark. Thank you.
Appreciate Carrie providing your concerns.
Yeah, I was just going to add just a quick comment. All drinking water plants, the chemicals used have to be approved by TCQ and NSF approved, National Sanitation Foundation. So there's no, there's no black box of chemicals that would be used in this plant, just like there aren't at Owen Stevens, just to clarify. Yeah, they're approved for use in drinking water plants, and they're approved for one, our crews to utilize them and apply them for disinfection purposes for the water, things like that. So, in the Inner Harbor plant, we can yeah, you know what? We'll share that with we can put that together. That's a good request, Bart. Yeah.
Because real quick, my understanding of it is that in order for the marine organisms and any bacteria or whatever that gets on the membranes, they have to, and something that might grow in the system itself, like, oysters, for example. I don't know if they'd grow there, but, some things are really microscopic when they're tiny, and then they get in and grow in the system. And so they have to use defouling agents that are kind of like that stuff you put on the bottom of a boat, which is toxic. If you've ever cleaned the bottom of a boat, you can't be around that material. It's carcinogenic. So the chemicals that they're using in the desalination process, I've read, are toxic to humans.
Yeah, so a couple of things. A lot of that goes to the design of the plant, because one of the things that we've looked at closely is the intake velocity of the incoming water into the plant, right? The greater velocity, the lower the ability for microorganisms to accumulate on the pipe. So I understand what you're saying, absolutely understand what you're saying, but a lot of that goes back to the design of the plant, which we've done some pre-design, but remember, we're not even there yet. But there has been pre-design work, and we have talked about all of those items you just discussed.
Would it be okay if we move on to the next?
I have one more thing to say.
Please.
Just on that front, I think I've heard things over the years about what the city's design parameters are. For instance, my understanding is the city's going to have a system to oxygenate the water coming out of the plant, or that is at least the plan. And so I understand that this has been a long process and people have missed certain elements of it. I'm sure I have too. So I would just say that rather than modeling a theoretical plant, I think to the extent you can, you need to model the plant that we are planning to design and build. And then one last thing on the other plant in Inner Harbor, I think you all did a condition assessment of the capability of putting that plant into operation, and I would just use your judgment based on how much you think what chance you really think that there is of that deal happening in that plant being used in the modeling or not. I know I have an opinion as someone on a government that they owe money to, but I think you need to look, you're going to have to make some judgment calls as to what to include and what not to include, based on whether you really think that's going to happen or not. Not just try to pile on everything one way or the other, because then you lose clarity by there's so much guesswork in what it is. I mean, I think what the council asked for was they wanted to see the effect of this plant, not necessarily the effect of everything else going on or maybe going on. So, thanks.
Jason, please.
Yeah, I just want to say I think we should include permitted plants, their assets. Even if CC Polymers doesn't use it, they might sell it and that person might utilize it. But I also want to comment on the output interval. I think 15 minutes is good. I don't think I'd want to see it greater than that, like an hour, unless there's some really good reason for it, especially if we're like looking at ship traffic mixing, because that's so temporal. And then spin up in time frame. Would that be like 3-month kind of spin up or 6 months or something like that?
Yeah, generally it would be a few months. It depends on the system, but basically to get numerical stability. And then after that, we'll have the simulation. And the spin up time period is not included in the results because you can't trust those results.
Cool.
I have a question about the output interval. So if it's 15 minutes, it would be like what the data could be every 15 minutes, but then that would be accumulated over like up to a year or two.
It would be over the duration of the simulation.
Okay.
So if we're using, I've heard anywhere from a few years to up to 30 years, the life cycle of the plant.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to suggest that we get exposure to the runs. This process of validating a model from simplest to confirm how things are working right now in agreement and then adding complexity. But during that process, for us to see the input and output decks what constants are used in the formulation, diffusion, et cetera. And it'll just give us confidence that, yeah, we're doing respectable work, nobody's pulling, things to get certain results. And by looking at the input and output decks, also seeing the residuals, how close to zero, those get, tells us that it is totally resolved, right, and things like that. So I'd like to see us all have opportunity to look at that and interact with it as a part of the process.
Noted. To keep up with the agenda, as we have a little bit of a challenge here, let's go to the next discussion area. All of this has been documented, and if there is a case where you couldn't share a comment on this specific area, you can do so later. Send us an email, and we will make sure to include that.
Moving on to the next one, we've got the physical and hydrodynamic variables. We've already covered some of these, and I suspected that these might kind of start flowing together a little bit. But this conversation now will focus specifically on our forcing flows, the physical processes that drive the movement of the water within the system, salinity transport within the modeled area. We can talk about our discharge characteristics, the rate and quality, inflows and outflows, freshwater inflows, and wastewater discharges, the stratification within the water column, any sort of tidal influences, seasonal variabilities, meteorological conditions, wind flow, and any sort of critical condition period that we want to talk about. I've included a few guiding questions once again, but opening up for discussion.
Sorry, before we hop into that, I have a question about people sending emails regarding this committee, because it's my understanding that it's supposed to be public discussion. And so if we do send the city emails, will that discussion be posted somewhere for the public to review?
Jessica, you're talking about individual and or group emails?
Yeah, just regarding this committee. How
Yeah,
can
I
those
think we
be made
can
available
yeah.
to the public?
We can post them, I believe.
Yeah, just a side comment. I think it's easier to document comments and feedback in this forum. One, because it's on YouTube and we've got a number of people taking notes. I always, we've seen all the emails. They're all very detailed. There's a lot of good information. I mean, it's easier for us to document. I'm not sure the process on how to post all of those emails. I guess you could. You could set up a website or something, throw them all up there.
Also, I would like to add to that. Those were my concerns too, that there was emails going back and forth that's supposed to, I would think, need to be shared with the public because it's supposed to be a transparent process. But also my concerns were, and I did put a little bit in the email, was there were questions asked and information that was asked to be provided amongst the committee members. And I don't think all the answers were given and the information was not provided. The concerns that I have is, we have a lot of people on this committee and it seems like they know what they're talking about. And I believe when they asked for specific information, especially when we were doing the scoring, is because they wanted the additional information that wasn't provided by the firms to do the scoring. So that was one of my concerns, is that if, committee members had questions or they needed additional information, that in some way it should be provided to them or to us, so we can get this model, this study done accurately. Thank you.
Just I understand that, Deanna. An RFQ selection process, I'm just going to explain the formal one that the city does, and that when city staff reviewed the RFQs, the information that's submitted, the staff has to review that information that's submitted. So in other words, it's not a back and forth with each proposer, because it can get out of control. So that's just sort of how a formal RFQ process is set up. I don't believe there's any ill intent there or anything like that.
No, I don't think there was any ill intent. I just think that, everyone on this committee wants to do the right thing and get the
Yeah.
right results, and they have particular questions. I mean, if you're narrowing it down to firms and they do not provide that information, that's worrisome to me, because not that anyone's hiding anything, it's just everyone's just trying to do this process correctly. And they should feel like that, hey, I've gotten all my questions answered, and therefore I can do the proper scoring. And that was my initial concern, that, everyone's trying to do this correctly. And we want this done so we don't have to continue to repeat the process. And so that was my concern, not to say that anyone was hiding anything.
Yeah.
I just think that, if they have questions and they were legitimate questions, that in some format they should be answered. Thank you.
I understand.
I had a conversation with Nick that I thought we needed to find a place during this meeting to have a discussion about the emails, because, yeah, I think it's out of hand and we need to have those discussions here on camera in front of people. I think if we have like a question, we should send that individually to staff. We shouldn't copy everybody. I know normal policy on government scoring is the scorers get the sheet, or get all the information, and you are not supposed to communicate with other people scoring about anything about the score. I did a CCISD one last week where it was interviews, and maybe it's something for the city in the future if you ever do something like this again. They had a one-pager that was kind of the rules, and the first rule was don't talk to anybody else on the scoring committee about how we're scoring this. And we were all in the same room together. And so, yeah, I think we just need to not reply all on the email chain. If we have an individual question for staff, or we think something should get added to a future agenda, I think we should email that to you guys individually and not copy the rest of us. And then, it's your meeting, so you make the call on whether to do that or not. Because, yeah, I think we need to get rid of that. Thank you for bringing that up.
I appreciate you making the point. I believe that the core team can further discuss and provide some guidance back to all of you on how we can use that tool properly.
Well, I think it's important, having done multiple of these during my career, is you need to do the evaluation based on what was submitted by the applicants, and not, if they left something out, that's a negative, in your opinion. But to go through an iterative process, that's not fair to the people who have submitted, because you need to get the same information to everybody that's in the process. So you need to look at what was submitted and not try to add on to it or subtract from it.
Can I say something about the model and back to the model parameters?
Please.
So thinking about the previous point, and I'll be very brief, I think we have to be realistic in terms of what is modeled. If you're looking at seasonal cycles, then it makes sense to go for a number of years, but then you don't need a 15-minute resolution output. If you want to look at what is happening with the mixing that is induced by ship traffic, then you need much finer scale resolution. So I think that's something that's important to define and communicate to the modelers, because we can't be asking for the highest resolution at every level for every question. It's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to do it. And maybe just modeling ship traffic under certain scenarios gives you an idea of what mixing would do, and then you can look at the broader scales with a longer time interval, be it a day perhaps. If you want to look at 20 years, maybe a day of output is enough. They're calculating, but they're summarizing what is happening on a daily basis. So that's I think something they would say. On the model parameters here, to me, when I think of a model, I think of input parameters and output parameters. And right now, it seems like they're all mixed together. So we should probably think of what is the model going to be using to run the simulations, and then what are we expecting to see in terms of the outputs that would then aid the interpretation of the environmental impacts. It might be easier to think of it that way.
we do have some space later to talk about the outputs, definitely. But I appreciate that.
So let's focus this then on the inputs.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And of the options that you just mentioned, would you prioritize one of them related to seasonal or the focus on the ship canal? Is there an inclination there?
I think they're all important. You just have to model them differently. So perhaps listing the impact of vessel traffic, the impact of seasonality, the impact of wet years, the impact of dry years, for example, might, have scenarios that are extracted from the data, but we cannot ask to have everything at very high vertical resolution, very high temporal resolution with complex parameters to look at vessel traffic. I mean, that's just massive.
Understood. Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, so for discharge characteristics, would the discharge salinity fall under that bucket? Okay, so for me, what's something I'm really concerned about is making sure that the discharge salinity is a product of the intake salinity, because that's what desalination plants do. They concentrate the intake. So, and that's actually surprisingly difficult to do in models like these. They're usually not set up for like that, for that. And I think it's really important for the Inner Harbor because, like we've discussed earlier, it's a somewhat confined area, and the intake and the outfall are pretty close to each other. And there are 2 permitted facilities within the channel, so there could be a lot of interactions. And so I'm just hopeful that we can do it in real time, where the outfall salinity is based on the previous time step for the intake salinity. Because traditionally, the way you do it is you run a base case without desal, you figure out the salinities, and then you create, you force the salinity for the outfall using like a Excel spreadsheet for each time step. And I think that would work in a bigger area that's not confined, but the way that the Inner Harbor is with what's proposed there, I think it's really important just to do it in real time to capture everything.
I have a question about the salinity. I was listening to the Corpus Christi Desal Partners, CCDP, their public comment or their presentation to the city. And am I correct in that they mentioned that they are usually combine the intake and the outflow? I feel like I remember them saying that. Do they have to use what's permitted? Do you remember that, Jason?
I was confused by
the TCQ permit pinpoints both the intake and the discharge.
So
it's
it has
part
to
of the
be
permit, so it's like you can't change it.
Okay.
It is what it is. Those exact locations are identified in the permit.
And the amount of intake water is capped at that permit amount.
Okay, so then that's what we should be modeling.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they were talking about sharing a pipe instead of having 2 pipes. That was kind of confusing.
No, there'll be 2 pipes. I think what the confusion may have been is the prior design was 2 pipes bringing in the water.
Mm-hmm.
CCDP has just 1 pipe bringing in the water.
Mm.
1 pipe bringing it in, another separate pipe discharging it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then I have another question regarding the model parameters. So is it realistic to model from Nueces Bay all the way to the barrier islands? Would that be like broken up? Or because that's a pretty large area, but definitely needed.
Well, we already have an example of that. The port had the EFDC model, which I think had that whole geographic region covered in there. Right, Jeff?
Yeah, we want to, if we can, a lot of these questions, the modeler is going to be the experts and will answer, but I requested that we have the most comprehensive scope or geographic limits. So it includes the Nueces Bay, the ship channel, and the entire Corpus Christi Bay. The entire thing from, all the way to the Barry Islands, to the university and over. Yeah.
Leaving any part of that out will absolutely destroy the credibility. It has to be the complete system. all the
Right,
way
yeah,
out
we
to the
want the
Gulf of
entire
Mexico.
system.
There's no.
The prior
it's not an
models did
option to
limited
not do
scope
that.
areas like just the ship channel, or I'm not sure about the ports, maybe the bay and the ship channel. I'm not sure if anybody's done we've heard some from and like Jason Hale, some of the concerns, and we have them too. We want to get the facts on the Nueces Bay, because the water would pull over through the power plant. So it's a whole system that we're looking at.
I was kind of to build on that, I guess, one of the things, going back to like the Sharon described like an input, definitely would like to see all the that's happening around wastewater treatment plants and reuse. Obviously, that's changing a lot about where fresh water is released in our area, and so some of it, is now going to be going back into the Inner Harbor instead of out into OSO. So as much as we can capturing, there's going to be changes happening in OSO around salinity related to all this too, and so as comprehensive as we can be as possible, and just making sure that obviously, the city's involved in all those projects, so as long as that gets communicated to the modelers, I think that's important, but there's just a lot of changing dynamics around that, right? So.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought about it today. Of course, Port Aransas is building a new wastewater treatment plant, right? That certainly wasn't taken into account in any previous models at all. So I'm glad you brought that up, Kirsten.
Yeah, and I'll just say, it was mentioned earlier, but I kind of take a different approach. I think as much as comprehensively as we can, I think that's always been our stance is looking at, I know we don't have a crystal ball and can't predict every single discharge that's going to happen over the next 30 years, but that's what we should try as much as we can, in my opinion. That's what everyone's concern is, and I think that's why we're doing this, is this kind of cumulative impact that could happen as our area changes, so.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether EFDC is boundary fitted coordinates or finite element, but one of the things that we can do is go in and fine grain the mesh in areas of concern. So again, getting in this idea of baby stepping this thing, we start out with a coarser mesh. We identify areas that are concerned from those results and fine grain the mesh in those areas. And sometimes you can extract and just with that given output do a sub-model of an area. So you don't probably want to do an all one. I think the model I saw, the EFDC, had pretty little discrimination at the bottom. So for example, if we see salinity, greater salinity persisting in a pocketed area, we probably want to, fine grain the mesh where there was just one cell at the bottom, we put in 3, for example. But I think that's what your modelers are going to tell you that we're going to do. In trying to have it all in all areas is usually a computational incapability. So
let us move forward to the next slide.
Yeah.
And Jason, and we move to the next, which is, we already touched on the boundaries, so please go ahead.
Oh, I just want to make sure that the large diversions have a diversion and return flow instead of just a return flow. Because like the power plant, if you just say that it's putting out a static constant salinity and let's say 300 million gallons a day, but you're not specifying that it's coming from the Inner Harbor, if you don't capture that correctly, it would be a mass balance error, but also it would I would think affect circulation. So I would hope that there is a diversion included when there's a large return flow, and that the salinity is also tied to that instead of just a static salinity. That's it. Oh, also, it'd be great if we had the vertical layering figured out to where there's the least amount of pressure gradient errors. That's it.
And I wanted to add to that, if you're modeling taking 30 out through a plant, a certain percentage of that is going to go back in as a return flow once it goes through the wastewater system. So.
Noted.
Okay, moving on to the third one, which is environmental and boundary conditions. Once again, we've kind of already discussed these a little bit, but we can always add more. Here's where we're going to focus on the conditions that the model has to be able to characterize under both the ambient and the simulated scenarios. So what are the model domain limits? What are we looking at for a baseline? What are our discharge conditions? What external forcing at the boundaries do we want to see? I've added some guiding questions again, and we can discuss on these now. So
you're asking what we think would be an impact that we want to look or keep an eye out for. So I think hypoxia is a big one. I know Dr. Hodges has talked about it. He said that isolation time is something that we should be looking at, how long a salinity plume is isolated at the bottom of the channel. And he said 24 to 48 hours is basically a precondition for a hypoxic episode. So I would like to know the isolation times of plumes, if we can keep a track of that. The frequency of potential hypoxic events and the duration of them is something I would like to see. For salinity, any potential permit violations would be good to know.
Can I ask real quick on that? You're talking about in terms of like dissolved oxygen or in terms of what parameter?
For the permit?
Yeah.
For
there's not-
salinity, good.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a little bit of a tough spot because there's not currently a numeric salinity criteria. They're under works though.
Okay, but it's a
So-
fluent percentage?
There is a percentage, there's a general guidance that, salinity is characterized as 2 parts per thousand or greater. There's a general kind of rise over ambient, and this is actually a talking point in a few slides, so maybe we should hold off until then. But maybe let's come back to this because I think it is a good, what are we evaluating against?
Okay, and the last thing is I'm curious about the increase in salinity to the Nueces Bay Power Station intake.
This one, Jason, the increase in salinity,
To the Nueces Bay Power Station intake.
okay, at their location there, okay.
Can I just point of clarification here? So we're discussing here what we want to see in terms of parameters and numeric outputs from the model. I do think from a process standpoint, we need a very well-defined anticipated process for how to translate that into ecological impacts or human health impacts, right? I mean, getting the numeric parameters, the outputs of the model right is the first step in that. But I think to Mike's point early on, if we haven't then, and David raised this in an email several weeks ago, if we haven't defined thresholds where we can in terms of ecological tolerances, this becomes subjective interpretation of these results, right? And we get, I think, specifically I'm concerned that we fall victim to a statistical approach rather than an ecological approach, where we know that statistical significance and ecological significance are not the same thing in this case, right? Thanks.
Well, to throw another variable into this, I saw some number on the Nueces Bay Power Station of 300 million gallons a day. They're actually permitted to take up to 605 million gallons a day. So that's another, if they ramp up to the full power capacity, are they taking 605 or are they taking 300? Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to try to bound the limits of our study and work. And for instance, the issue of hypoxia. Okay, let's go back to the process that's being used to desalinate the water. The process involves dissolved air flotation. That process will saturate the water with oxygen, okay? The water that goes back into the bay will have a whole lot more oxygen in it than the water that was taken out. Hypoxia is an interesting topic, but if we're oxygenating the water beyond what we took out, there really isn't a way to associate hypoxia concerns with this particular facility. That's the type of thinking that we need to examine and limit the scope of what we're working on.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. So for me, hypoxia is an indirect effect of having a higher than average salinity plume that is not interacting with the water above it. And so it's blocking oxygen from coming down and reoxygenating the bottom waters of the channel. And if you look at the core mix model, it shows a like 2 to 5 meter plume that isn't mixing with the water above it, and it's not decreasing in size for 2 miles. So for me, that's a cause for concern, and I think it's worth examining.
Understand the differences between the two concepts. They relate, but there is that second effect to the salinity plume. Okay.
Just to follow up to what Jason said, I fully agree. Yes, you're oxygenating that water as it initially comes out of the plant, but then as it spreads out and moves downstream or wherever it's going, you have this higher salinity water because of the higher density. It's going to be sitting near the bottom, and it's going to lose oxygen over time. And so the other issue, aside from it just being kind of stuck in this bottom layer, is that just by nature of it being higher salinity, it naturally holds less oxygen. Higher salinity water holds less oxygen. So you've got two factors there that are affecting the oxygen levels in that water. So it's really important, I think, to consider this issue of hypoxia potential.
Whose core mix model are you guys referring to?
At the cities and TCEQs. I think the cities goes up to 2.5 miles, and the TCEQ goes to maybe like 4.
Okay, which report?
So the TCEQ did a diffuser report, and I did a public information request, and I have it with me if you want to look at it. And then I also did a public information request for the cities, and then got it from their modeler.
And I'm referring to Oceanography 101. When you have salty, denser water, it sits on the bottom, and that's just how it works.
Right. I guess my point is I mean, we have newer design than that the city paid for from the guys, I mean, the last group of guys that were designing the actual diffusing system.
Right, but you're still putting saltier, denser water out. So regardless of how it's designed, that water is still going to eventually sink down to the bottom layers, and you're going to get stratification. I mean, that's just...
I don't think that that's what the guys who build these for a living and monitor them afterwards have experienced.
Well, David, that's Oceanography 101.
Yeah.
That literally...
Let me, I think where the subtlety comes in this, and I agree with you, Mike, is that the extent to which this could happen is going to depend on the diffusers and how quickly that salinity is mixed into the water column.
Right.
And that's going to depend on the current speed, and of course that's driven by the wind speed. So these are all things that are going to be in the model. So how well the model reproduces the near field is then going to impact what happens in the far field. And we've been talking a lot about the far field, but we haven't really talked within this context about the near field. So if it doesn't mix very well, you're going to have a plume of high salinity that can be, just cubic meters and cubic meters of high salinity water that, especially during the summer, when the upper layer is very warm, is going to basically put a lid on that exchange between the atmosphere and the water. And just to give you an idea, if you put an oxygen sensor out in seagrass beds, which is shallower than Corpus Christi Bay, overnight the oxygen goes pretty much, very, very low, close to zero. And that's because there's so much organic matter in these systems that they just respire during the night. So we have these natural processes that consume a lot of oxygen in the water in these shallow estuarine systems. And in the summer, you're not going to have a lot of oxygen in the water, and then you can have these plumes, which could cause hypoxia.
Yeah, I've got a little bit different, but on the geographic limits on there, should we consider the upper Laguna Madre? Why? Because the Barney Davis power plant that circulates about twice what the Nueces Bay does. So it's pulling water out of the more saline Laguna Madre and putting it into the Corpus Christi Bay with it. Right now, Baffin Bay, you're about 60 parts per thousand. So that water's coming down basically through wind-driven currents on there, and we're picking that up at Barney Davis, going through the Oso and putting it in Corpus Bay. But the importance there, here's a plant that's permitted, I think it's 500 million gallons a day on there, that it does have a big adjustment in the Oso and in the Corpus Christi Bay because it's pulling out of the upper Laguna Madre on the south side of the causeway. So by including some of the upper Laguna Madre where we're pulling that 500 MGD, I think they're running about 300 MGD right now. But okay, 700, yeah. And that plant, the Barney Davis plant's twice the capacity in Nueces Bay as far as megawatts. It's 996 megawatts versus Nueces is 500. So.
Well, and the study that was done for the port to look at the Port Aransas scenario for the discharge from Harbor Island, the one that Jason found a link for, okay? In that study, it reports that they did not successfully model
Right.
either the
Either
water
one.
in Nueces Bay or Barney Davis.
Mhm.
And so that's an absolutely critical parameter to get that incorporated. It complicates the modeling a lot, but it's also very necessary.
Yeah, totally agree with the importance of including those. The ports modeling effort, the EFDC plus model that developed the mesh that's been in discussion here was actually not for Harbor Island, it was for La Quinta, but regardless, absolutely agree with no, it wasn't. It was for La Quinta. That's what I'm saying. It wasn't for the location in Port A. It was for a proposed La Quinta. It was a proposed location on the La Quinta channel, not for the Harbor Island discharge. So just to clarify the point of origin for that model, it doesn't matter. I absolutely agree with the point about the broader spatial extent.
Let us speed it up a little bit and move to the next discussion area so that we can comply with the agenda. All of those are very valuable comments and discussion documented. Agree that there are too many variables in consideration at the end. We will need the feedback from the modeler to understand how they can pull that together, what options really are. So let's go to the next one.
The last parameter talking point we have is the assumptions and the sensitivities, and then we are going to dive into the outputs of the model. So with this, I'd like the discussion to focus on what are acceptable assumptions and what sensitivity analyses are important to include. Parameters including the key assumptions for modeling, the sensitivity analyses, and addressing any sort of model calibration and validation. Here's some guiding questions, and I open it for discussion.
Yeah, I would like to make sure that the near field in the model is mirroring any kind of core mix near field modeling we do. And also the velocities in the channel in that area is also lining up with the velocity used in core mix. And if possible, the core mix that we have right now that I'm aware of is a singular velocity, and it'd be great if we also had like a 90th percentile and a 10th percentile velocity, just to make sure that they're matching up as the currents change. And then ship traffic, like we mentioned earlier, for sensitivity analysis.
When you sent out the information, there was reference to the city having gotten this study, and in the emails I asked if we could all see that for information, you know, to discuss these from. But if there's pertinent information, you know, the one, I'm forgetting the name of the other modeling company, we had Spheros, and the other one had done some work, and they referenced that as a background, and it looked like they were not actually performing the work, that they were taking other things, but there was something put together and a lot of key information that you were referencing. You know, we really need to look at getting all of the data input so we have a good model. But can we get that? Are you going to disseminate the information from that? Because it would supposedly have a lot of that in it.
Sorry. I'll have to look into it and get back with you.
Okay.
Oh, you, me? Go for it. Okay. All right. So actually, I'm just going to address this to you, Jason. Are you suggesting, I just want to make sure I understand, are you suggesting coupling core mix with this new model in some way?
Coupling would be good if the model has a jet plume discharge module, and that's easier to implement. Just I would ask that we double check to make sure it's aligning with the core mix modeling. But coupling would be good too, if possible, because that's been recommended a couple times.
Okay, yeah, I guess I struggle with that a little bit just because having seen these critiques of the core mix model, there are some serious issues there that I would be concerned about, you know, linking that model up, which we now know has some serious and probably fatal flaws, with this far field model, because then you're kind of injecting error already into the new model. So I don't know. I just think maybe we need to be very careful and cautious about that. But I mean, I'm open to ideas. So I'm not the one doing it. So I mean, maybe the modeler would have a better perspective anyway.
Right. Yeah. I guess for me, I thought it was using the near field to make assumptions about the far field. But the first 100 or 200 feet were, or whatever it is, 400 feet may be accurate. Also, one thing I wanted to make sure we kept an eye on was the Richardson number. That kind of describes the vertical mixing of the area. And some of these models can have artificial numerical errors where it has more vertical mixing than is allowed by physics. And so a good way to double check to make sure that isn't happening is to be aware of what the Richardson's number is for those areas.
Noted. Is there an additional comment related to these areas discussion? Next item on the agenda that I want this group to move on is the results evaluation framework. So one last opportunity for an additional comment. We're good? All right.
The results evaluation framework is going to be defining how our model outputs are evaluated, and basically the goal here is to come out with a clear framework for interpreting these modeling results. We only have one slide, I believe, on this. It's has different kind of layers here. So specifically, what must be clearly reported in the model results? Accumulation of salinity, time extent of the observed changes, and the spatial extent of the changes. We have reference levels. What are we using as the reference levels to guide these reviews? There's a rise over ambient salinity concentration, maybe a salinity reference, the established baseline. Like I said, the TCEQ is working on narrative criteria, but they're not available yet. Maybe there's another source we could use. And then the interpretation of the results is how should the model changes be characterized relative to the reference levels. So does the model change exceed a reference level? Is the exceedance temporary or sustained? Are they localized impacts, or are they more broad in the spatial extent? Are they during sensitive time periods or critical conditions? And just a general, what is a successful evaluation framework? What are we looking for?
Stuck here in this corner. This corner is like killing me here. Yeah, just circle back to what Jeff said. We have a framework here, and maybe Sharon has some other ideas as well. But this vulnerability assessment that Basin Estuary is paid for, maybe Kirsten, you could make that, like send it out to the group or something. Okay. And there are, I mean, it is a really solid framework to consider the ecological impacts. But I note also, there are experts in this area in terms of interpreting what this means for fish or whatever that are probably not on this committee. So Greg Stuns, I'm Greg's rep now. Dr. Jim Tolan comes to mind. He was with Texas Parks and Wildlife. He has considerable experience. So, it may be that we want to engage with some other folks as the results come out there. I certainly don't have all the expertise. I mean, Sharon knows more about fish and shrimp than I do, but there's probably other people that you could consult with as well.
There is, and I think it would be a good idea to be able to have an opportunity to consult with them before getting back to the committee. Those of us that are working with these colleagues that are that can help us assess the impact of the environment, which is the ultimate goal in addition to the human connection. I'm not qualified to say anything about the human side of things. But one of the things that I would like to mention is that I think we have to keep the parameters that we examine from the model output relatively simple and not keep this very complicated. So we have salinity guidance here. We can establish thresholds. I think the baseline, it's a shifting baseline, depending if it's a wet year, if it's a dry year, if it's, a normal year, whatever that is. So I think that those critical parameters for under what conditions do we or could we see salinities above a certain threshold, that is what we need to be looking for. I have a feeling this model is not going to include oxygen, so we're going to have to rely on just the level of stratification, perhaps, combined with temperature to have some idea of what could be happening with the oxygen on the bottom. Because that's a biogeochemical component that I don't think the proposals did not include that, so that's not going to be in the output. And having a spatial representation of where these high salinities might be under what conditions would be very, very useful to examine the potential effect of the impact. One output that I think is important and that is not particularly complicated is the residence time in the inner harbor as a function of, for example, wind direction and wind speed and tidal fluctuations. Because it's a simple mass balance in the end. This is a channel, right, with one real exchange with the bay. So we know we put a certain amount of salt in there, we have a residence time. We can calculate back of the envelope how much salt is going into the bay system. And that should match what we're seeing from the model output. It should make sense.
I think just one nuance on the inner harbor, recognizing that 7 miles long and residence time is a variable at different points, and it's going to be highly heterogeneous between mouth and, for example, the Tule Basin, simply because even if you're taking the mechanical mix as a function of vessel traffic, the proportion of vessels that make it all the way to the end of the channel is diminished relative to those at different terminals along the way, right? So depending on where the outfall is relative to predominant traffic patterns. I mean, absolutely agree. We can calculate with assumptions, but there probably again is some nuance there talking about specific reaches of that channel as well.
Well, they can chop it up in pieces and report residence times for 5 transects or something.
Yeah, for sure. But again, spatial scale matters, and I would just ask feedback to the modelers. We wouldn't want to paint the entire inner harbor with the same brush. Again, we can help with informing what would be rational geographic increments and which set of assumptions regarding vessel traffic and other parameters might be useful for each of those segments. But I think there is a systematic approach there. We just want to make sure we don't paint that entire 7-mile reach the same way.
Okay, and as Jeff said, highly variable for the inner harbor. Well, the whole bay system is highly variable. And as we're looking at outputs on there, we need min maxes on there, average min maxes, and then we need the highest and lowest by season on there, because we know all our biologicals on there at different points in time and different temperatures on there, they're going to behave differently. So if we don't see information either by month or week or whatever on that, it doesn't do us a lot of good, because we are very seasonal in so many ways. And going back to Jeff's point is the variability that we've got in this system, and the changes we've seen in this system in the last 170 years are completely different. We're completely different where we are now than where we were in 1845 when changes started to happen.
Yeah, so for residence time, we could do particle tracking, right? Where you take a negatively buoyant effluent particle and see how long it takes to leave the inner harbor on average. I think that would be interesting. Maybe even like a neutrally buoyant one too, if we're worried about toxins, or maybe a super negative buoyant one for like a heavy metal or something like that.
Just for the listening public and the lay people like myself, so I know we're measuring salinity, that's the main thing. And then it sounds like the oxygen can increase in the water if there's a lot of salinity on the bottom. And
decrease.
Oxygen can decrease, which is bad because it creates hypoxia, correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, so hypoxia, maybe just describe what's bad about hypoxia and what a real person walking down the sidewalk on the bayfront, if the bay turns into be hypoxic, can you describe the negative impacts to just people and also to wildlife? Just to educate the public that's listening.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So hypoxia means low oxygen. And so there's a general definition of less than 2 milligrams per liter in marine systems. And it's kind of this little bit subjective term, but basically once you reach that level and below, then you potentially end up killing your fish and your shellfish and things that need oxygen to breathe. So it becomes very detrimental to marine life. That's what hypoxia is. And then anoxia is when there's no oxygen in the water. So another term that I know we've heard thrown around is residence time. And that, for those of you who don't know, it's basically how long a water mass takes to get in and out of a system. So, I mean, there's probably a better way of describing it, but I mean, so anyway, I was just gonna say, I agree with Dr. Herska here. I would like us to keep dissolved oxygen as, at least to consider it as a variable, because I know that, at least for the model that the port ran, EFDC, there is a dissolved oxygen module for that model. Now, we could come out of here and realize that nobody's doing EFDC, and then in which case it's doesn't matter, but there at least is a module for that one to consider.
I want to ask Mike about that stage. The function of what we're doing here is getting a model done. It's not a judgment. These folks aren't going to be judging whether this is going to have environmental effects. And so you mentioned that there are people that are really qualified in that. We don't have a contract for that. That's under scope. I feel like we haven't decided how we're going to handle it when we get to that point of having this model complete, of having experts evaluate this data. It's one thing for us to have opinions, but I think in the end, it needs to be looked at by people like yourself and others you might recommend. And Mike, what's your suggestion of who we all need to look at this when it's done?
Answer that. So I was asking Nick, I mean, the modeler should give us some analysis. It's not going to be just a data set and say, here, you figure it out. So we want some written narrative. I'm going to expect that in the contract with them. So
in terms of the impact on fisheries.
Yeah, in terms of everything in the bay, fish, grass, whatever's there, water quality, Carrie's comments about skin, human skin. We need it has to be, this group here, some of you on this side understand this, but the majority of our community, I don't think they'd be lost in this conversation right now. So we need something that is multiple levels. One that helps people that know a lot of baseline material, but others that don't, they can read the report or the summary of it and have some takeaway that makes sense to them. This committee here represents the community, but we're doing this work for the region, not even the Corpus community, the entire region that either lives here or comes here from time to time to enjoy the bay. And so,
yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is I see us looking at a computational model of salinity largely here. But, every PPT change is different than the one previous, going from 37 to 38 to 39. This is expertise that, we need from people like Mike and others on this. And
well, that's what they're going to do. So Mike will read the report. You're going to be, you all will read it before anybody, sections of it, components of it. And that's what you're here for, to give feedback to the modelers along the way, as well as the end conclusion.
I guess that's an important question though, Peter. Like, will there be an opportunity for those of us on the committee who have those connections to experts that maybe we need to consult with to take that report to them and ask for their input and opinion?
Yeah, you can talk to your family, friends, your family, friends, expert consultants.
No one in my family wants to do this. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. They're not going to provide a whole lot of input.
We'll take the 3-year-old. But yeah, you can do that. They'll be able. The material will be shareable.
I'm thinking in particular, Mike. So to go back again, I know we keep harping on it, but the report that Dr. Paul Montagna did for us that kind of set that framework, how salinity relates to the particular salinity criteria for different species in our region. And so the framework's there, that can be easily, it's a publicly available report, we can provide that to the modeler already, but I think also then pulling in people like Dr. Montagna and Dr. Busky, Dr. Herska, there's a lot of people that we can hopefully draw in.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the members here I put on this committee, the council had a choice a chance to put 9 members on, I put another 9. And a lot of the individuals I put on represent you all from the basin estuaries, the universities, the experts in the field. And that was by design, so we can get your input.
So these results, when we get down to actual details, how many fish are gonna die under these short-term conditions or long-term conditions getting into the response of the fishery and our systems? I don't see that on the results list. I see is changes in salinity, but again, if that's just part of what this committee is to get to, it should be part of the results.
I think it goes to the, I'm sorry. No, I think it goes to the interpretation of the results, right? So after we get the results, then the idea is to put that in the context of potential impacts to the fish, shellfish, bottom. And that is what I think we're equipped to do. The thing is, it takes a village to really have a very good scientific assessment. I guess what we just want to make sure, at least I want to make sure that at some point I'm going to have a chance to go back to the people that I work with, that Mike works with, and we have a more comprehensive evaluation of the model results. It's not only me as a scientist, despite my experience, or Mike, so we get a better assessment that we can then share it back. You know?
If I could share a comment, all of you represent a certain sector of academia or a segment of the population or certain people. You are meant to draw upon those resources so that you can provide comments as a spokesperson. We've made that same comment in our Water Conservation Committee advisory committees as well. So the goal here is to assemble these 18 people who have broad-reaching knowledge and expertise among all your contacts, and then we come back together.
I just wanted to say, you know, because I was kind of the person on the email chain that said, okay, if it's half a part per thousand, what does that mean? If it's 1, you know, I mean, what is too much? What is too little? And I think if we expect regular people to have any sort of idea as to this not being a complete waste of time, we need to be able to quantify what is a good result and what is a bad result. And I understand that it can be variable based on when, but you know, if you can't say we're measuring this and this is good, this is too high, or it's fine, then it is an exercise in futility and we're not doing anything. I would add that you all did a very good speciation study, I thought, that showed, you know, critical species, and I think we need to be able to say, you know, this is what we think the change, if there is any, and this is what the species, you know, this is what ambient normally is, this is how much natural variation we have, and this is what the species that we have in this ecosystem can normally take. Because there has been a lot of hyperbolic statements about, you know, what a relatively small amount of change in exchange will do to the bay. And I think the whole point of this is to give the council and the community greater clarity on what it will actually do. Not what a plant will do, but what the plant will do. So.
Yeah, we agree with that, David. And another way of saying it is that this committee needs to understand what does impact to the bay mean? Because everybody, probably all 19 members have a different opinion. So the committee at some point needs to come to consensus about if there's a unified message to the council, which is what does the impact of the bay mean? Because it's a different definition.
And I will add, it does not happen in a vacuum. Not having a plant operating here puts further pressure on our upstream freshwater sources, and those upstream freshwater sources fuel what I've been told over many years by many scientists is the most critical part of our bay system ecologically. And so, you know, if we want to do a 20-year model on what happens if we don't have any inflows in the Nueces River because every drop of fresh water we're sucking out to put in people's houses and businesses, that would be an interesting study too, because I think it would show far more severe ecological damage than this would, but that's me.
Can I mention some specific indicators that I think would be useful? One of them is the current field in the bay close to the channel. So is there concern, for example, is it going towards the beaches where people are, or is the predominant current going in the other direction? So that could also help and inform, because the winds are going to be pushing it along shore in one direction or the other, most of the water. Something else is the density structure of the water column is going to be very important, and it's going to come from the temperature and salinity. So we're going to see if we have very low-density water, which is basically going to cap what could be in the subsurface. I mean, that's a simple parameter that I'm sure that the modelers are going to have, but we need to have that very clearly in spatial representation and temporal representation, time series of when, how this would happen. If that made any sense.
Carrie, and then Jason, and then Greg. Let's try to do it as quickly as possible.
Okay.
We still have 2 more items on the agenda, so I would appreciate your comments.
So getting back a little bit to the hypoxia and the dead fish. So just for people who are listening, what would that mean to people? What would a bay full of dead fish mean to people? And I think nobody really knows that. And so it could mean that, I guess, dead fish are washing up on our beaches, that our downtown marinas filled with dead fish for a while, and it gets really stinky, and people wouldn't be able to go in the water. So I think it's, and that's why this plant is, people are, debating it, whether or not it's because of how it will affect the people and the animals who live here. And it's not just about, we have to do the plant because we need water. It's, okay, we need water, but what else are we going to be sacrificing? And I think that that's the big picture that we kind of are, so far in the weeds, that you just got to keep reminding people, we're trying to discover what's going to happen, the worst case scenario, if this plant is built. And we want to know that beforehand. But since we only have like 3 months before they're going to supposedly approve it, without all the science, then they're going to just then track it. And then what happens if the plant is operational and the modeling that we're showing for 5 years or 10 years is showing we're having all these problems and we've spent $1 billion? Is it planned to just close it down? So the public needs to know all those things, that if this modeling, this science shows that this is damaging the bay and we're not going to put up with that, and the TCEQ is not going to put up with it, we're going to lose $1 billion. So those are things that this is the big picture, I think, of what we're talking about. Sometimes we get away from that.
Can I clarify something off of her comment? Thank you for bringing up hypoxia again. I just want to have everyone and myself better understand how oxygen would be modeled, because biogeochemical processes have very many inputs, including what organisms are around there, and the water chemistry, which I'm not sure that we have enough data on to accurately model the oxygen side. And so I would just like the people who know more about that to kind of comment. And of course, we'll ask the modelers, I think next week, if they're able to do the oxygen side, but I just want to know if that's feasible in y'all's opinion.
Well, I don't know what their model looks like, but I think that the 2 parameters that are very important are the respiration rate, so how much oxygen is being consumed in the water, and how much the water is exchanging the oxygen with the atmosphere. And they basically can parameterize that. So if you have a very, what we call stratified, so layered water column, you're going to have exchange of oxygen in the near surface with the atmosphere, but you won't have that oxygen getting to the bottom, which then can cause these low oxygen conditions. And I mean, there's always, it's hard to say exactly what would happen, but in a typical hypoxic event, fish move. Like people, like off the Mississippi River Delta, where they have huge hypoxic events, what they see is that the fish move. But all those things that don't move, that can't move, that are benthic, they tend to die after a certain level of oxygen. And then when they die, they decompose. And when they decompose, then it depletes the oxygen more. And when that happens, you basically have a barren area. I'm not saying that is going to happen here. That's how the mechanism works. So the question is to try to see if this model has an oxygen component, under what conditions could you have hypoxic events? Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that's a very good description. I think about it too in the longer term. In this bay system, you know, you have the biological activity, the respiration, and then also, you know, the impact of the winds and mixing and how much oxygen's going in there. But then you just have the changes in salinity and temperature as well, which saltier water and warmer water holds less oxygen. So if you think about this over a 20 or 30 year time frame, the water is getting warmer, and you know, it's probably getting saltier if you have ocean water coming in, and then you've got this discharge on top of it. So it does create this additional stressor effect on the dissolved oxygen. And you know, Sharon makes a good point, which is that, yeah, fish will move, but I've also worked in systems like Baffin Bay and also in Pamlico Sound and Neuse River in North Carolina, where in these more restricted systems, the fish will die. You will get big fish kills, and it's not a pleasant sight. So that is, I think, the big concern. I think Carrie made a very good point, which is, yeah, you know, you think about the impacts of not having fresh water coming down the river, sure, but you also think about if you got, you know, dead fish littering the side of the bay because you've had a fish kill. That's also not a great thing for tourism or whatnot. So I think there's just a lot of different factors coming into play here.
So let's keep it to the slide. If you have any additional comments, we only have 10 more minutes trying to accommodate to the agenda. Next slide is about the QA/QC process, which I believe that would be of interest to all of you as well. So is there an additional?
It kind of falls into the next slide then.
Okay.
All right, the last slides here is talking about our internal and external review process. This is something that you guys have brought up previously, and so I think it's more of an information gathering, you know, what do we really want to see and what is a successful QA/QC process. So the purpose being defining how model performance and methodology will be reviewed and refined prior to finalization, with an outcome being quality assurance and a quality control plan that demonstrates that this model is defensible. So going back to this slide that I introduced at the beginning, I've added some green and orange arrows just to simplify that there is probably this independent internal review, this quality assurance, and checkpoints essentially along the way for the entire process. And then this external review kind of introducing this concept at the point of calibration, validation, result simulation, really where there's something that people can look at and see the results of. So I think this was the only slide I have here. Yeah. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and opinions on what does a successful internal, external review look like?
Will there be any, it's talked about in the past about independent peer reviews that are outside of the hired company. Is that a thought that can be done or not possible?
I think we can address that in the next couple of slides. That's a good point though, Aaron. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the ports studies, I think it was one of the ports one, had what I thought was a really good look where they ran the model versus the observed salinity conditions and said, okay, this is where our model was successful and this is where it failed. Just as kind of an honesty, because I mean, you really can't ever, as Sharon said, you can't model everything. You know, you can't jam everything in and hope to get a result. And so I think being able to show what it was dry without the plant versus what the actual observed conditions were is a really important thing for everyone to see.
And to that note, I think velocities are really important. So to make sure that whatever velocities the model is producing lines up with field measurements.
And back to the earlier point I made is that looking at the iteration, the residuals. So for example, that salinity at this location isn't still changing as we step forward in time of the computation. So, you know, depending on the parameter, it's something e to the -3 maybe, or 5. But that's something interactive with the people on the bio side. You know, are we going to get to within, you know, 2 decimals on salinity change or something like that to see what's real? But we should be seeing things in an accepted solution set that are nearing an asymptote and not changing.
To kind of follow up on David's point on there, on the port study, they did a good job of publicizing the calibration and the data differences on there. So I hope in this modeling that we do that. And the further back we can go on the calibration, since we're in a highly variable time period on there, would be most helpful with it. Now, we've got limited data coming in. Our salinity measurements are not that broad. But at least we need to calibrate to that, and also very importantly, the temperature data on that too, because on that calibration, that model ran low on salinity, and it I think it ran hot on temperature. So to the DO side with it, because practically as far as doing DO, do we really have the time? Because we're on there, but at least we've got a proxy with temperature.
Appreciate it. Noted. Next item of the agenda are the results of the scoring to the statements of qualifications, but I just want to give a pause if anyone else have an additional comment to the previous. We good? All right.
I've got one other comment on there. We were talking about the biological impacts, and there's been a number of good scientific studies on the different species with the impacts on salinity. So if those could be distributed to this panel and probably the greater public with it with the port's application and the city's application, there's a lot of information sitting there. We were talking about it here, but we've actually got these reports with it by species, by salinity, various impacts. For the public out there, and in some cases, in some species, more salinity helps, and others it deters. So it's got a mix both on a time frame with it. Thanks.
Understood. 2 more.
Good. Just to Mr. Smith's point, a lot of that information is summarized in this Bays and Estuaries report, so I'm sure you can get that once Kirsten's.
Okay. Yeah, Jason.
Okay, real quick, just for the overall results, I feel like, you know, our primary charge is to figure out the impact from the Inner Harbor plant, but I think context matters. You know, if Inner Harbor increases the salinity, let's say 0.5 part per thousand or 1 part per thousand, that's good to know. But if another plant is going to increase the salinity or have a DO burden that stacks with that, it's important to have that context when we're looking at this facility. So I think context matters. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, noted. Let's move to the results of the scoring. So on this slide, you will see the total average from the scorings that you all have made. We have 2 firms, Hazen and Sawyer and Spheros. The first table shows, first, if they pass the minimum qualifications criteria, both passed, and second, the total average score. So you can see that the results are a little bit tight. Hazen and Sawyer has a 76.88 score, and Spheros 86.94. We also have a little bit more of detail because of how the scoring worked. We have 3 categories: firm's experience, team experience, and quality control process. You can see the scores and how that develops in the table below, where Spheros scored higher than Hazen and Sawyer in the 3 categories. Yeah, please.
I didn't want to share that as per, you know, was alluded to earlier. I wanted to put my input to you guys without sharing. I didn't do that, but I will share here that in looking at the depth, the technical depth, you you know, there are engineers and there are engineers, there are scientists. The people that write the code are deep in that topical area. And it's my opinion, after looking at the two and looking at this, that if there were, that the depth of the Spheros team, which had the LRE, they bought them. And if you looked at the theses that were written by the team members, plus that they have DTI, who wrote the code, employed as part of this effort with us, to me, they stood head and shoulders in terms of their thesis work, the team. Not saying the other team isn't capable and qualified, but it looked, to my estimation, from a pure technical standpoint, strength of technical, not just, you know, here we evaluate how much experience they've done with it. It's one thing to be an engineer that uses a piece of code that somebody else developed. You know, they know how to run ANSYS or something, right? But here, what we're looking for, this really depth of expertise, I felt was much deeper with the Spheros team and the code folks that they have from DTI.
Appreciate the comment, Brad. So moving on to next slide, we have the evaluation committee scoring. So you will see that results are close between the two firms. Spheros Jet in the total average scored higher than Hazen and Sawyer. And going down to the category average, Spheros as well scored higher on two of them, and actually in the team experience it scored the same as Hazen and Sawyer. So now I just will give the word to Nick to add to the scoring.
Thank you, Jose. Just some comments, and I do, because of my position, I get to see a lot of RFQ results for a lot of different projects, and it is unconventional to see scores this close. Scores not just from this committee, but also from the city staff panel as well. I've never seen scores this close. So we do know, all of you, it's been great listening to all of this. We do know how critical this is. Every one of us is vested. So one thing that how we're going to approach this, and this sort of goes back to what you alluded to earlier, Aaron, is our plan is to hire both firms, right? They have both agreed to work in concert together. This provides, it achieves peer review. It achieves the firms to provide different inputs. One thing that the city panel, we went over their comments in detail yesterday. They brought up each team has different experiences. And I think all of you can agree. Spheros has a lot of great experience in some ways, but then Hazen brings some other strengths as well. So that's how we're going to approach this, is we're going to work with both of them to get them under contract. They both stated that they would work together. I don't have the details of that, but they are, and yeah, I'm not being funny at all. I'm really not. I think this is the best thing in the world right now. I think it's a great approach, especially after listening to all of your comments. That way we can use the strengths of both companies, and it certainly, I think, improves quality control, and it'll improve efficiency is another one of my goals as well. So we're going to reach out to both of them and try and have them both here next meeting. That was our initial goal. So we got some schedules to coordinate, but that's the goal right now.
I think it sounds like a creative and encouraging approach. Can we assume that Spheros, because they were the highest scoring team, would be the prime? So, I mean, at some point you do need a chain of command and decision making. Is there an assumption that they would be the prime and Hazen would be sub to them?
I think that you could certainly take that away, use that as a takeaway. My comment to that is I want to get them both in a room and talk through it and see if there's any agreement on thought. Might be idealistic, but my goal is that if one entity disagrees with some determination from the other entity, they can talk through it and we can all work through it and come to some consensus conclusion.
Just love the ambition and optimism here. I think that, in my experience, where you have competing firms and there's potentially a proprietary approach, especially if one has more experience with a particular model than the other, there may be hesitancy to do that work, to sort of reveal process to another team. I think if it comes to that, we should reevaluate the strategy of including both, because I do think that the presence of DTI on the Spheros team was the critical differentiator, especially to Mike's point about the availability of the DO, modular addendum effectively to the FDC plus model. It is I think from our experience, the most robust model available, and our opportunity as a community to get the most out of this process by having the model developer available to configure it in a way that yields the best results for us, I think is really critical. And so I think preserving their role in the process is paramount. And so if combining the teams somehow would compromise their participation, I think that's a trade-off to really carefully consider.
Just add to that, so Nick brought this proposal to me to hire both, and that was one of my comments, which is who's in charge, because if everybody's in charge, no one is, so it could be that one of them, like Spheros, does the modeling and Hazen and Swire does peer review, but let us have them talk to each other. Nick did do what we talked about, which is would they even be willing to work with each other? And the answer to that question was yes. So now we'll kind of see, okay, what does that mean? And we'll bring that back to this committee. I would prefer to have somebody in charge of the modeling and somebody in charge of maybe peer reviewing, because you're right, that proprietary stuff can get in the way. But I think it's good news, which is not only are we going to have one group, but we'll have two experts helping us through this process. So,
Can I make a comment about the two firms? One possible strategy is to get them on the same page regarding what the data are that are going to be forcing the model. So what are the inputs? And then let them each do their exercise. Because they're all models, they're simulations of reality, right? So just like in hurricanes, now they're running 10, 15 models, and then you get an ensemble, and you try to figure out which ones agree, then we would see if they agree, rather than having, they have to, if we get widely different results from two models, then we need to figure out why. And which model's giving us the reality, and the validation process is going to help us with that. Right? Rather than having them try to evaluate each other. I think it would be more up to us.
I like your hurricane example. I think you're right. We need to see where they converge and where they diverge. I think that's right, exactly right.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that. So TWIA, which insures about half of the windstorm in the 14 counties on there, they use 4 models on there. There's a 40% range between the models. None of them are close with it, so it's given to the board to decide what should we do, and the last decision was they weighted the top end 20%, the bottom end 20%, and the two middles at 30%. But the big thing here's models that have been developed over decades and tens of millions of dollars spent on them. There's a 40% range for the same output.
I got a quick comment. I have a concern by having two modelers. I really do. You have two different firms. They may have two different approaches. When I was reading the qualifications for both Hazen and Spheros, it looks like Hazen had more of like a supportive to projects instead of being the lead on the projects. That's my one concern. And two, like Dr. Sharon said, we may get two different outputs from each one, and that's kind of like starting from the drawing board. Now, after that, then we're gonna have to figure out, okay, which one is right, which one is wrong, or are they gonna have to combine their data, or are they gonna have to start back from the beginning again? I think choosing both firms is counterproductive. I thought that's what we do the scoring for, is to choose the firm that is most qualified to do the Fairfield model. And that's my concern, that hiring two firms, it's probably going to cause some kind of conflicts. And so that's just my input.
Having two private companies that are competitors, asking them to collaborate is really not a formula for success. It is not a formula for efficiency, Nick. It won't work that way. I've dealt with technology competitors all my career, and they are there to prove that they're right and their way is the best. And if you want to let them work independently, now you have another challenge of who's right. You know, you haven't made the process easier or better, I don't think, when you try to force them to collaborate, honestly.
So I appreciate that, Roger. I mean, we're not forcing anyone to do anything. We reached out to them. They said they would work in concert. I'm trying to be careful with my words here, right? Because we haven't worked out the arrangement yet. I think the city manager made some good points that one could potentially be a lead and one could be a peer review. The doctor at the end of the table made some good points about, you know, seeing where different models diverge or converge. I think that's important as well. The important thing here is getting accurate results. And I think another committee member brought up the need for potential peer review. We've heard that multiple times already, so this could accommodate that as well. So I don't have all the details worked out, but we'll work through it. The committee will be made updated. We've got a next meeting right around the corner for sure, and those details ideally would be discussed and reviewed with this whole team at that time.
Just might suggest that of the potential respondents, there might be some that are quite qualified for a peer review initiative that weren't willing to commit to the timeline of the project, but that probably have credentials that, you know, would make them a very qualified peer reviewer.
Just wanted, if I can, throw my agreement with Roger. And if you look at the complexity, we already talked about how big this thing can get, and I'm concerned that with two, I would like to see us get iterative input. So, excuse me, so we don't have somebody from the city that doesn't have the technical expertise being the middleman here, but that you really do use what this team has here in looking at these interim iterations. So in the sensitivity analysis, we look at all these parameters, all these different starting conditions that we can have, all the different inputs. It's a lot to do. And now if we were involved and you're having us be involved for that interaction, you got two going on with all these multi-parameter pieces. I think it's pretty unwieldy. So combined with the intellectual property concerns and how that can get worked through, they might be less willing to share the depth of that in interaction with us if they know we're talking. Now we've got to keep those discussions. If they want them walled off, we're going to have a complex thing on our hands here too.
No, the intent would not to wall off any discussions, right?
Well, but the intellectual, once you have two competing on this, there would be more of a tendency to maybe not share some of the things that they would have when they know it might transfer to the competitor. So I'm in favor of the peer review as a second and have a primary to work with as complex a study as we have going on here.
So I do want to, just a quick comment, I mean, the intent is for this committee to be involved throughout the process, right? To have, I know you said, I just want to reassure you, I know you brought it up a couple of times today, but that's the intent. Yeah.
Reminds me of that old joke about the first rule of government contracting is why have one when you can have two for twice the price? But I think there's a variety of viewpoints here. I think all of them are kind of valid. I think which is the most valid will be the result of your discussion. I think you've heard the various points go work it out with your contractor or contractors, whichever it becomes, and I think get moving, because we need to get moving is the most important thing at this point. Thank you, guys.
Let's go with Carrie.
Yeah. So when we all were looking at the two SOQs and assessing the information, and we were given a 0 to 45, say, to give to each group, maybe you give somebody 45, and then you're not going to give the other one 0. You're like, well, they're pretty good. I'll give them 35. And the fact that somebody actually won, it's kind of like in an election. You don't just go, well, they're both good, let's both let them run, sit in the city council seat or whatever. I think that the committee made a decision. I think the other people made a decision. And we should definitely not have them work together and have the one team, the Spheros team, be on top, and then later bring in the other team. But give them the power to do this thing. I think it's clear that everyone thought they were better. So just because the other people were also good, that not everybody gets a ribbon.
Thanks, Gary. We understand where the concerns are coming from. Details still need to be sorted out. More information will be coming for all of you. Respecting your time, as we are now over the time, I just want to share with you the next steps we have. So we do have a next committee meeting next Thursday, 12th, where the modeler or modelers would come in to present the scope of work, the details, and there will be a window for all of you to provide questions and have those questions answered. That is the last point of the agenda. I know that this was good discussion. We have captured all of that, and this will be used as input for the city staff to take into the conversation with the modeler.
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate right quick again. This is a major concern for me to have 2 modelers. And it bothers me that they were reached out to before we got to this committee meeting. It's just not going to sit well with me at all to have 2 different modelers, because this committee did the scoring, and Sparrows was got the top scores, and that's who the city should go with. It should not be 2 competitors, I agree, and it's just not going to sit well with me to have 2 separate firms when we did the scoring and we chose by the numberings who should get or who should do the Fairfield model.
Jose, is there an opportunity for any of us to participate virtually next week? I know we can watch, but is there a virtual participation option?
Yeah, so we can set up, in other committees, we set up a WebEx, and the committee members joined via WebEx, which allowed them to participate. Because if you watch on YouTube, of course, it doesn't allow the committee members to participate. So please let us know, because then we can make sure we get you the right link and everything.
Yeah, I know it's not preferred, but it is, a lot of us travel with families next week.
No, it works, yeah, we accommodate that.
The session next week is intended to be interactive with the proposed modelers, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think you need to unbound the meeting to the point where, we have a session today that's 2 hours long. You can't get everything in. You need to have a somewhat open-ended meeting to let people get their questions in.
Does the committee want to do a longer, is that what you're suggesting, Roger, a longer meeting next? If necessary.
Shut it off when people quit asking meaningful questions. Yeah, that's right. Ooh.
Is the committee generally in agreement with that? Anybody against doing that? I just want to be respectful of everyone's opinion.
We can still plan for the 2 hour, right? And if needed, we can go beyond that line.
We can host that.
Okay. So having said that, we covered all of the items. We appreciate your time, your comments, all of that is documented. There is a lot of work going on. So appreciate all of your participation. The meeting is adjourned.